Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the Director of the UK's Global Warming Policy Foundation, Dr. Benny Peiser.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to both organizations for inviting me to brief you on the situation in Europe. Some of you may have seen the piece in the Financial Post this morning. I'll go into more detail today, but before I start, let me briefly tell you about the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Our think tank and educational charity was founded about 3.5 years ago by Lord Lawson, myself. As was mentioned, we are non-partisan. We are an all-party and non-party think tank. We've got members from all three main parties. Now we've got 4 parties, but at the time there were really just 3 parties, and they are all presented on our board of trustees. Here are some of our trustees. Lord Lawson, who's the chairman, was the former chancellor. He was also Secretary of State for Energy under Margaret Thatcher. We have Lord Donoghue, who was senior policy advisor to 2 Labour prime ministers. Lord Fellows, who used to be the Queen's private secretary, the Bishop of Chester. We've got Sir Martin Jacob, former deputy chairman of Barclays and director of the Bank of England. We have a Liberal Democrat peer, Baroness Nicholson, and Lord Turnbull, who used to be the head of the civil service in Britain. So we have a very heavyweight board, a very broad board, and this is our approach to the issue of climate change is mainly to look at the policy implications, the economic implications. We don't have a view on the science. We don't have a collective view at all. We don't regard ourselves as climate skeptics. We're a very broad church that ranges from skepticism to agnosticism. We also have members who are essentially accepting the conventional wisdom. But what unites us is not the main concern about the science, but about the implications of the policies, which we think are much worse than anything climate change has been doing to our society. When we started, we were at the very periphery of the political debate. There was an overwhelming consensus, political all-party consensus in Britain that global warming was a serious and immediate threat to Britain and the world, that it had to be tackled no matter what the costs, and that the debate was over, full stop. Our whole raison d'etre is not to claim that we are right and the others are wrong. Our main mission is to open this debate properly, because we feel there never has been a thorough debate about all the issues, science included. And so we're not making strong claims one way or another, but we certainly want to encourage analysis, critical analysis, and discussion. So as I said, our main focus, in contrast to Friends of Science, for instance, other American think tanks, or North American think tanks, is that we do not mainly focus on the science. When we set up the think tank, decided that the weakest aspect of the whole climate change debate isn't actually the science, but is actually the policy and economic implications of what governments are doing to approach climate change. So the key points of my presentation really is to try to brief you on developments in Europe. Europe started very early with the concern about climate change. It turned into an obsession. It became an all-encompassing, all-embracing obsession. Europe introduced policies, unilaterally, legally binding policies that are binding governments throughout Europe to certain policies. This approach is now disintegrating, and I will be talking about the reasons why we are facing a major car crash on these issues, why there are, for the first time, serious doubts among the political elite in Europe about the approach they have taken over the last 20 years, and why they are beginning to shift the debate back to issues of competitiveness and economic growth. So here are the key issues I will be addressing. We have to remember that people won't believe me, but that Europe really, at some point in about 2000, had the mission, the goal to become the most competitive, and I quote from the Lisbon Agenda of the EU, the most competitive and most dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world. And we all know how successful that has turned out to be. And capable of sustainable economic growth with more and better jobs and greater social cohesion by 2010. That was the goal. And I will tell you about the reality of what actually happened in Europe. The Lisbon Agenda, which was focused on economic growth and technological advancement, conflicted with the Green Agenda, which coincided with this Lisbon Agenda. Some years later, the EU decided to implement these legally binding targets. 20% greenhouse gas emission cuts by 2020, 20% reduction in energy consumption, and 20% renewables in the energy mix by 2020. These are legally binding targets. Of course, there was some burden sharing, so not every country had the same burden. Some had to carry some heavier weight and others were exempt a little bit, but basically no other part of the world took this on board. Of course, the Europeans always argued that someone had to lead the world, and the Europeans were quite happy to lead the world. No one told them, though, that if you lead too fast, you might fall off the cliff and no one is going to follow you. And this is what essentially happened. No other country in the world adopted any of these binding targets, and we all know what happened in Copenhagen and the international stalemate over an international agreement resulted in huge disillusionment in Europe, because they then realized that they had taken on board these very costly policies and no one was willing to follow. So these are the targets, and they remain written in stone. Some countries simply ignore them. Other countries like Britain have taken on even more extreme targets. In Britain, the so-called Climate Change Act was voted in Parliament by the entire House of Commons. More than 600 MPs voted for the Climate Change Act, which makes decarbonization by 80% by 2050 legally binding. Only 5 MPs in the whole House voted against that act, and that shows you how complete this collective madness was a few years ago. In the meantime, while our political leaders were obsessing about these targets and legally binding emission cuts, as you may have noticed from the news, Europe is in a deep economic and financial mess. Unemployment has risen to almost 30 million. 30 million people is a lot of people unemployed, and this is kind of official figure. Unofficially, it might be much more. Just to give you an idea, youth unemployment in Greece currently, that's people aged 18 to 25, is 2/3, 65% of young people in Greece, and a little bit less in Spain and other southern European countries. Essentially, it's a lost generation. No one knows when these countries in the south of Europe will ever become economically competitive again. But in the meantime, a whole generation is being wasted. So the reality is that Europe is struggling terribly, economically and financially, and this idea that it might turn to become the most competitive and most dynamic economy in the world has turned really into a laughing stock. Europe also faces enormous competitive crisis. I mean, in the past, Europeans were mainly concerned about low-wage competition from Asia, India and China in particular. This has diminished somewhat because wages are going up in China, and so the gap is narrowing. But the new concern about which I will talk in a minute is not so much China and India anymore. The biggest problems Europe faces is competition in the Western world. And climate and energy policies play a huge role in that man-made crisis. Here you can see which regions of the world are actually growing and which are struggling. What has happened in the last couple of years or so is that it became ever more apparent just how costly the shift to green and renewable energy was and has been. You all heard about the German decision to phase out nuclear energy and to move into renewables. The German Environment Minister recently warned the German public that this shift will, in all likelihood, cost Germany 1 trillion euros, 1,000 billion euros. Obviously, completely. And we all know that, Germany is not the Sahara. It's not the hottest place on earth. Nevertheless, this wealth transfer, which it is essentially a wealth transfer from ordinary families who have to pay for this energy shift to big landowners and the kind of top people who can afford to invest 40,000, 50,000 euros for solar panels. This is the biggest wealth transfer in the history of modern Europe, in a way, from the poor to the rich. So there's a social aspect. I will talk about the social implications of this failed policy whereby ordinary families and small and medium-sized businesses are essentially subsidizing the investments of green do-gooders. And I think that in itself, the political class can accept. So, they are quite happy with green subsidies for their supporters. But what affected and changed the whole debate, and which has caused nearly panic in Brussels is the shale revolution and its consequences on European industry. The energy price in the US nowadays is a third of what the energy price is in Europe. And that gap is focusing people's minds, not least because a growing number of energy-intensive industries no longer invest in Europe. It doesn't make any sense. There is simply no business model for building an energy-intensive plant in Europe if you can build the same plant in the US where the energy price is a third of what you have to pay in Europe. And this is what's happening, and this is why the green agenda is crumbling. This is the real reason. That we haven't had warming, additional global warming for the last 16 years is certainly an additional factor, but it's not the key factor. Because this, the scientists tell the politicians, okay, this is just a blip, this is just natural variability, wait another few years and then it will start warming even faster and even more. It's for politicians to know that the warming has stalled is convenient because they can adopt a wait-and-see policy, which is basically what a lot of European governments nowadays have adopted on this issue. They have adopted it's perhaps not as pressing, it's perhaps not as immediate of a problem, so let's kick this into the long grass. This is what I meant, the gap between the European, never mind the Japanese energy price and the energy price in North America, in the US in particular, as a result of abundant and cheap shale gas. I mean, shale gas is a huge problem, not just for the Europeans and for their manufacturers. Shale gas is a huge problem for all competition. We noticed that the nuclear industry is struggling as a result. Very, very few nuclear power plants are being built in North America or in Europe. The coal industry is struggling because they have real competition. Never mind the renewable energy who hate shale because it undermines their whole business model. But the fact that energy is very, very cheap in the US and in all likelihood will remain comparatively cheap for years, if not decades to come, is certainly changing the investment prospects for European companies. And these are the kind of news stories that you regularly now get in European media and newspapers, basically telling policymakers that Europe is falling behind, not least because the Greens are opposing any shale exploration in Europe. There's a huge delay. It's very, very difficult for companies to replicate the American example. And so there are growing concerns, and I mentioned in my piece in the Financial Post that there will be an energy crisis meeting in Brussels by the EU leaders later this month on the 22nd, and this meeting is sending out a very clear message. We can't go on like this. We have to change direction. They don't say exactly how they are going to change direction, but they are signaling that the old policy is no longer working, is undermining Europe, is undermining its competitiveness, and something has to change. And I'm quite happy to talk later if there are any questions about what that actually might mean. So the obsession among policymakers and governments and ministers is to look at what is happening in the US, the huge industrial revival companies and heavy industry, heavy energy industries are relocating, reshoring to the US, not only from Middle Eastern countries where energy is traditionally cheap, but from all over, particularly from Europe. You have big investors going to the US, seeing all the opportunities on the back of cheap shale gas. One of the big developments that have already occurred, partly as a result of the financial crisis, many European countries are heavily overdebted. Some of them are insolvent, essentially. Okay, so they print money. That's basically the policy solution to some of the southern European nations. They're more or less bankrupt, but the European Central Bank says, okay, well, we'll print you some money, and that's the kind of plaster, short-term policy approach. But one of the big changes over the last 2-3 years has been that country after country is beginning to cut these very generous subsidies for renewables. Remember, when I say very generous, think about a landowner, and we've got plenty of landowners in Britain, who have put up wind turbines. If you put your money into the bank, you're lucky if you get 2 or 3% or 2.5%. I don't even know how much, if you have a lot of money, how much interest you get, but perhaps somewhere between 2.5%. If you build a wind turbine, you will get a guarantee return on your investment of 10% for 20 years, guaranteed, tax-free. There's no question, if you are in money, where to invest. So the incentives are enormous, and that in itself wouldn't be too bad if these wind turbines would actually generate any electricity and would reduce CO2. The problem, of course, as we know, is that the wind doesn't blow all the time. So they often produce electricity when there is no need, for instance, in the night. Or there is no wind in the winter when it's very cold and you need a lot of electricity. These landowners are also paid a lot of money to switch off the wind turbines. We had stories where they are being paid up to £1 million just to switch it off for a week or two because there was too much on the market. So this is a big problem, and there was a big public backlash. They also despoiled the beautiful British countryside, and local communities are extremely opposed by and large. And this has led to a political revolt in Parliament. Over 100 MPs wrote a letter to the Prime Minister opposing the whole subsidy regime for wind farms, and this has led to a slowdown and to a cut in subsidies both for wind and solar. In fact, in some countries like Spain, they've cut subsidies retrospectively. So even though, this is Spain, even though they had a kind of law and it was for investor legally kind of kosher, they would say, oh no, now we have run out of money, so we actually have to renege on our legally binding regulations. And they've begun to tax renewables as well. So they are clawing back a lot of the money they've thrown away. So the irony in Europe is that as the Greens oppose nuclear energy and as they oppose coal and as they oppose shale and as they oppose natural gas, there's really very little policymakers are left with, other than solar and wind. But the biggest irony of all is that because the emissions trading scheme, the cap and trade system in Germany, in Europe, has essentially collapsed, and the price has collapsed from originally, I think, 28 euros to less than 3 euros. It's now very, very cheap to burn coal. And there's a new coal boom in Europe, of all places. Germany alone is building some 25 new coal-fired power plants because, you know, if you shut down nuclear and you can't afford natural gas, something has to be burned. I mean, you could, you know, in Britain, I'll tell you later, they burn books to get their homes heated, but in Germany, they go back to coal, which the Greens don't like, but it's very cheap, and the energy sector and the energy industry is simply, and the Americans have a lot of coal now that they are shifting from coal more and more to gas. So this is the biggest irony, whereas the rest of the world is going for cheap natural gas, green Europe is going back to coal. Here you see the power plants in planning in Germany. It's all over the place. And the biggest irony, really, is that the dirty Americans who have never, ever introduced any climate law, any targets, any cap and trade, nothing. They are reducing CO2 emissions. Back to the 1990s, they are falling off a cliff because they're moving more and more from coal to gas. Whereas in Germany and in other parts of Europe, it's the other way around. They're moving from natural gas and nuclear to coal. So that's the irony of green Europe. But as I said, the biggest worry of all are these stories. The stories that European manufacturers are beginning to move their new investments to the US, and that they are telling governments, unless you bring down energy costs, more manufacturing will be lost to Europe and more will be moving to cheap energy countries. So this is really the beginning of a new realization that the battle, the international race, industrial race of the 21st century will be a competition between countries that go for cheap energy versus countries that bet on expensive energy. And it boils down to this fairly simple conflict. Let us remember that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was successful because there was cheap energy. There was also cheap labor, but the combination of cheap labor and cheap energy was what made the Industrial Revolution possible. Now, when even the German industry, which is perhaps one of the very few industries that is actually still competitive in Europe and not a complete basket case, warns that they fear losing the edge internationally because energy prices are skyrocketing. In Britain, energy prices, the average household energy price is, I think, £1,400 per year. This has trebled within 8 years. It used to be about £500 8 years ago. Now it's 3 times as expensive. So energy prices are going through the roof in most European countries. And of course, as long as people are struggling, governments don't listen too much, but once the industry is struggling, they suddenly realize they have a problem on their hand. So here are the stories. European industry flocks to the US to take advantage of cheaper gas. dollars pouring into the US, no longer investing in Europe, the energy price gap growing. That is where the biggest fears for European policymakers really is. The loss of competitiveness, the loss of industry, the loss of manufacturing. This is what they need, like a hole in the head, because they are already struggling. And now being told that they essentially become uncompetitive is the worst case scenario. These are, as I said, just the stories of the last few months, and the message is quite clear. Soaring green energy taxes could force firms out of the UK as industry becomes uncompetitive. It's simple. You don't need to be a social scientist to understand that. Very simple. Of course, we were always told that this is free. Wind is free, and solar, is free. The sun doesn't cost a penny, and the wind comes for nothing. I mean, this is the kind of argument on which governments made policies, believe it or not. Now they do realize that it's about 5 times more expensive than conventional forms of energy. And of course, you will all have heard about this interesting vote in the European Parliament, which used to be, up until a month ago, the greenest parliament on planet Earth. I mean, whatever you introduced, whatever green scheme, whatever green initiative, you would almost automatically have a majority. And so for the first time ever, the European Parliament rejected to rescue the struggling emissions trading scheme and essentially killed it. I mean, it's still struggling on. As I said, carbon price has collapsed to about €3, but it's meaningless. It's completely meaningless. It has no effect on investors, on energy decisions. It's more a ritual, a religious cult, than a policy instrument. There won't be any investments on the basis of such a low carbon price. And so people were shocked to realize that European members of parliament, basically the European political class, was willing to kill its most important flagship policy they have in Europe on climate change, the emissions trading scheme. So the price here collapsed from 25 euros per ton of CO2 to less than, to about 3 euros. It's now international laughingstock. No one takes it seriously. Other countries like Australia, who've linked up with the European emissions trading scheme, are suffering badly, because a lot of their budget calculations were based on a very high carbon price. All of this, of course, has gone up in smoke. Yeah, I thought sums it up. If even a paper like the Washington Post, which has a reputation for being very green and taking, climate change and renewable energy very seriously, ever since they started in, the 19th century, I guess, when even they blame Europe for being a green energy basket case, it tells you something isn't working, right? And that is, of course, the signal that Europe sent out by killing its own flagship climate policy scheme to the rest of the world, essentially meant that whenever European negotiators will go to the next UN climate summit and will seriously tell the Chinese or the Indians, you have to cut your emissions, they'll just start laughing. They won't be taken seriously. I don't really want to go into the exact figures of the cost, but European officials estimate that in the last 8 years, since 2004, the emissions trading scheme and the subsidies for renewables have cost European consumers and energy consumers some 600 billion euros. So we are talking huge amounts of money of waste. It's wasted money, it's decreased competitiveness. We also know for each subsidized green job that was created artificially, at least 2 jobs in the traditional industries would be undermined or even would be destroyed. Politically speaking, what governments also fail to realize is that the public is willing to go along with these green policies to a point. Everyone wants to be green, everyone wants to look green, everyone wants to be on the side of goodness. So everyone will say, yes, this is wonderful, this is fantastic, we will all want, you know, these wind farms and solar panels and renewables is fantastic, and we are the goodies, we are on the right side of history. However, there is a point where it begins to hurt, and that is when these energy bills come in and they rise as they do, and families are struggling to pay their bills. This is what is happening in many parts of Europe. In Bulgaria, public protests over energy prices toppled the government half a year ago. There were mass protests on the street because people were angry about energy prices. And this has become one of the biggest headaches for governments around Europe, the rising cost of energy, not just for industry, as I mentioned, but for households. So let me tell you about energy poverty in Europe. This winter we had stories, particularly in Greece and in Germany. There's a growing rush into forests during the winter to cut down trees and forests, to burn and heat homes, because people can no longer afford, particularly in Greece and in parts of Eastern Europe, can no longer afford conventional heating. In the UK, we have, I think, currently about 7 million families in what is called fuel poverty. That is, at least 10% of your disposable income has to be spent on energy. Poor families and pensioners in particular are affected. We had stories like this one, I think a couple of years ago, where pensioners would go to charity shops and buy cheap books, like, you know, where you get books for 20 pence or 30 pence, and they would buy whole chunks of book, and they would actually use that to heat their homes. I mean, this is not common practice, but it was an indication of the severity for some people of how they struggle to heat their homes. So here, fuel poverty is when a household needs to spend more than 10% of their household income on domestic fuel use. But let me give you a better picture of what the reality of fuel poverty actually means in a country like Britain, which is not a tropical country, as you know. These are the stories we read in winter. 500,000 of pensioners spend Christmas in bed because that's where they could keep warm. To save money, they spent Christmas in bed. On average, every winter, about 30,000 people die as a result of cold winter, which is called excess winter deaths. So there is a real social scandal. And of course, part of the problem is old, bad housing, but part of the problem is that energy is costly. And so therefore, particularly poor families have their homes warmed only slightly to keep costs down. In a prosperous country like Germany, where energy prices have doubled in the last few years, about almost 1 million Germans can no longer pay their energy bills, and they are disconnected from energy altogether. And there are estimates that this green energy shift will lead to 15% of Germans ending in fuel poverty or energy poverty. And again, in Germany, a new trend, going into the forests, cutting down trees and heating homes by wood. So these are the issues that are now much more of concern to ordinary families who are, after all, voters, to industry and to policymakers in Europe, which is why there will be this energy summit on the 22nd of May. The signals seem to be very clear. For the first time, governments are sending out a clear message that there is a problem with the current policy approach, particularly with green energy, which is too expensive, and with a competition that is going for cheap energy. Let me briefly turn to the situation in Britain, because that's where we are based and where perhaps the biggest policy shift is beginning to materialize. As I said, in 2008, the Climate Change Act was voted by almost the entire House of Commons. 30% of electricity was supposed to be generated by 2020, from renewables by 2020. This is not going to happen, of course, but it just shows how obsessed Parliament was at the time. It was introduced by the then Labour government, but it had the support of essentially every section of society. So you had the Conservative Party completely in support, the Liberals completely in support, the Scottish National Party, Democrat Unionist Party from Northern Ireland, 50 or more green NGOs, the Confederation of British Industry, which is very green, the trade unions. Every sector of the society was in favor and was promoting this. And in the whole of Britain, there were just 5 MPs who dared, in a situation, as I said, of collective hysteria, to vote against this bill. So it was a very strange, I don't think it has ever happened. And in any case, we know from history, whenever our parliament is unanimous on issues, they mainly get it wrong. It's always a kind of clear sign that things haven't been properly discussed. If everyone is agreed, there must be some lack of discussion. There are, a number of issues where, when there's overwhelming majority and all party, consensus, something is wrong, and we have a good track record on that. And so this consensus, this huge consensus that was, of course, much bigger 5-6 years ago when the hysteria was at its peak. We're now in a cooling phase, right? But this hysteria and collective madness crashed against the wall in Copenhagen when it became apparent that some of the biggest CO2 emitters would simply not sign on to any international agreement. And since then, it's obvious that there will never, ever be an international, legally binding agreement on CO2 caps. It's quite simple why it's not going to happen. Because energy demand in China and India is going to triple in the next 30 years. And there's simply no other way of providing energy to these countries other than conventional energy. So they simply can't commit. And that penny has now dropped. Of course, the Indians and Chinese are not stupid. They didn't say, no, we're never going to sign to any agreement. They say, yeah, we'll sign. However, because you started this whole mess, and we're poor, you're rich, so if you want us to sign, it's just 100 billion a year would be okay, knowing full well that, of course, no American president, let alone the Senate, would ever agree any such wealth transfer. So basically, there is this international agreement that we all agree that someone else should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. That's an international agreement. And so the other reason why the consensus, the green climate consensus crumbled was the backlash that I mentioned, the public anger about the wind farms, about the green taxes, about the increase in energy cost. All of that caused a major stir in the last 2 or 3 years. And of course, we have made our point as well. As I said, our main focus was on these issues, on economic issues, on the societal, the financial issues, rather than on the science. And this has resonated very well with large parts of the British media and the public, and as a result, with a growing number of policymakers. And of course, we have a coalition government between the Conservatives and the Liberal Party. And the Treasurer, George Osborne, is one of the foes of the Green lobby because he's responsible for making sure that somehow the economy doesn't falter altogether. And he has crunched the figures and has realized that some of the policies are economically not viable and has opposed them. So there's a split in the British government between a more reasonable part that realizes that some of the policies are economically not viable, and a more green wing of the government that thinks the costs are not really important. If you want to save the planet, then it's not important what it costs, you just have to do it. Yes, and the good, to tell a little bit of a good story, the good story is where we might be sitting on a big gold mine. Perhaps not as big as Canada, but it would appear that Britain's shale plays are humongous, enormous. Some of them are 5-6 times thicker than anything you've seen in the US. And estimates, there's a whole scandal about official estimates figures, but the British Geological Survey has been tasked to estimate what the potential shale reserves may be. And apparently, so the media reports, when George Osborne, the Treasurer, wanted to announce these figures, his opponents in the Department of Energy and Climate Change said, well, perhaps we should send the British Geological Survey back. They have to recalculate the figures. They apparently didn't like these figures. But it would appear that there are huge shale reserves, and this could be a shot in the arm for the British economy. However, because of the government splits, everything has been delayed, and the government is dithering. Now, most parties are in favor of shale, but the company that started in the north of England got a license in 2007. It's 2030 now, and they still haven't got any shale gas out of the ground. So that tells you just how bureaucratic and red tape this process has been. But eventually, we are hopeful that this will be part of the solution of bringing down the energy price. So Europe is faced with this big divide between the green lobby and the green agenda that wants to save the planet and the policymakers who want to save the economy. And this is the divide that is raging. The debate is raging. This debate will be informing policy making for years to come. It will be about whether Europe is willing to take risks, because every new venture means you have to take some risks, although people tell policymakers that shale gas extraction is comparatively risk low, compared to other forms of energy extraction. But there are there's big opposition, not least from vested interests, all sorts of, we have Gazprom as one of the biggest opponents. They think shale gas is environmentally not very friendly. When Gazprom is green, you know exactly what they mean. But they don't like competition. And of course, the renewable energy sector doesn't like competition. And even the traditional natural gas exporters like Norway don't like competition. Who likes competition? Apart from consumer, right? The consumers love competition because they will benefit from it. But if you're in the game and you have a vested interest, you don't like it. So that's where we are, essentially. We are in a situation. The good news is that for the first time, we can see people realizing, what the heck have we done? That's the first, way to improvement, is that you realize, this isn't going anywhere. How this will translate into a policy shift is difficult to say at this stage. But there is growing realization that the whole approach taken over the last 10, 15 years has undermined Europe, has undermined its economy, has undermined its industry, is going nowhere, and has to change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Benny. Benny has agreed to take any questions that you may have. So if there are any questions, would you please raise your hand? And we have a traveling microphone, Ken Gregory in the crowd, who will bring the mic to you.
Sir, I was wondering, now that you're in North America, are you going to the U.S. to tell the story?
Can you please repeat that? I didn't get it.
I wondered if you were going to go to the U.S. to tell the story.
Am I going to the U.S. to tell this story?
Yes.
I'd be happy to.
But
I haven't had a phone call from Obama yet, but I'm more than happy to brief him.
Don't wait on him giving you a call.
Well, obviously, the work we're doing is mainly focused on Europe, but a lot of our readers and subscribers are from North America as well, so they at least follow what's happening in Europe. A lot of policymakers are subscribed to our electronic newsletter. Perhaps quite a number of people here get our newsletter regularly. But you're right. The Americans should... Is it okay to say Americans? The
yes.
US Americans,
yes.
Right? They should also be... they should also realize what would happen to their own, and partly has already happened, at least the kind of dithering and the kind of delay of certain policies can happen to their economy if they underestimate the costs of these salvationist, what I call salvationist policies.
Thank you.
Dr. Peiser, I have a double-barreled question with respect to Germany. Do you think that in the end the Germans actually will totally shut down their nuclear power industry? And the second part of my question is, you say they're converting on a large scale to coal, but the great coal mines of Germany were mostly abandoned, allowed to fill with water, cave in. Tremendous engineering problems there. Where are they getting the coal?
The coal you get from everywhere. It's very cheap. The Americans are shipping huge amounts of cheap coal, but you get coal from Russia. The Germans also use their own coal, which is unbelievably subsidized, still subsidized. On the nuclear issue, this is a good question because this is regarded, the nuclear phase out is regarded as perhaps the worst policy decision Germany has made in perhaps the last 20, 30 years. Because also the way it was decided, it was a kind of knee-jerk, no one expected it, it was kind of, there was a meeting of some ministers and the next day they had decided this is what we're going to do. There were elections coming up and people thought that this was a very short kind of knee-jerk political response. The Swiss, just to give you an example of how to do it, they also want to phase out nuclear, but they are shrewder. They said, yes, we also want to phase out nuclear, but we will phase it out in the next 50 years. That leaves everything open. But if you say you want to phase it out in the next 6 or 7 years, then, and you switch off already 6 or 7 automatically, then it's much more difficult to shift. Are they going to reconsider? I mean, let's not forget they did reconsider because the phase out was decided 10 years ago by a previous government in Germany, by a Labour and Green coalition government. Then the new government said, we won't switch them off, we will extend the lease. Then they did a U-turn. So in politics, everything is possible, and I wouldn't rule out that at some point, as the energy prices go through the roof, and there's a real problem with energy prices, and there are still nuclear power plants working and working perfectly, that some of them will remain. As I said, in politics, things change quite rapidly. So I wouldn't rule it out, but for the time being, there is no political majority whatsoever in the meantime in Germany for changing the current policies on nuclear.
Thank you very much for your presentation, most interesting. I have a question for you, and that is, how do we inform the public, because our media is certainly not very cooperative, about how Albertans, for example, are being fleeced by the wind industry in Alberta? We currently have over 1,000 megawatts. There are plans to build 6 times as many wind turbines in Alberta. Our school boards are negotiating with a wind company. They're being lied to. They're told wind is free. We all snickered when Dr. Peiser said wind is free. That's what your school boards are being told, and you're going to pay a lot for it. It's very expensive. How do we get the message through to the public when we have an uncooperative media that refuses to tell the truth about things like wind? There's such good examples in Europe, and our public, oh, a few wind turbines, who cares? And they're not very good. I don't like them.
Well, this is a difficult question because there is no easy solution. All you can do is to be as truthful and as accurate as you can be. Don't overplay the argument. Don't go over the top. And in Europe, the reason why there is some backlash against wind is for two reasons, which might not apply to Alberta, and that is that people are directly affected by wind turbines in front of their houses or villages or towns. Their countryside is despoiled. And the second is that energy prices are going up as a direct result. That's what people don't like. The media is a completely different issue, unfortunately, because climate change has become so politicized and almost a kind of belief system. You're either with us or you're against us kind of attitude. Some of the media have bought into it, but other media are quite happy to report about facts and actual or factual problems with the wind argument. And our approach has been to try to inform as much as we can and inform particular policymakers, but also individual journalists who are open-minded. People who are not open-minded, it's difficult to approach because they don't want to engage in a debate. But there are enough journalists who are interested in factual information, and the emphasis is you really have to be factually accurate, and you have to present your arguments in a way that isn't over the top, that isn't polemic, that isn't using the same kind of scare tactics as the Green lobby. I mean, that is something what I find in the US in particularly often difficult, because it's so entrenched that you are either, you're either with the Republicans or you're either with the Democrats, and once that is settled, no one cares. So there is no proper open debate. And the whole goal of our organization is to somehow find a forum where debate is still possible and look at the facts in a reasonable and a rational way. I know it's very difficult, but I think the climate, the political climate, is now more conducive to opening up some of the debates than perhaps 5 years ago.
I just want to thank you very much for your presentation. And I'm sure a lot of people who've been here before know the science sort of justifying some of the points presented is somewhat flawed. But as a vehicle for social engineering and as a vehicle for retooling society, and I was pleased to hear you use the term wealth transfer, it's an excellent vehicle. Because I've heard of, for example, garbage cans, which we've got in our alleys now in the UK. If your garbage can is like an inch over, it's a big fine. And these people aren't very flexible about these things. I'm reminded, Peter Lougheed in 2006 held a conference which was co-hosted by George Shultz and a number of other North American corporate and government representatives. And the first two items on the agenda was a carbon tax. This was in 2006. And also the idea that we shouldn't really tell people what we're doing because the public won't like the fact that we're retooling our governments around different lines. I'm just sort of curious about the nature of the discussions you have about how this is being used as a tool to push cultures and societies in directions that maybe aren't even in their interests at all.
No, you're absolutely right. This is part of the problem. Goes far beyond science or economics. Part of the problem of the lack of an open debate is that it has become, for a lot of people, a belief system, which is difficult to, it's difficult to debate if you are completely, if it's part of your identity and of your life and your lifestyle. Unfortunately, the only realistic way of tackling this problem is by pointing out the social contradictions and the economic perverse incentives of many of these policies. I mean, was already mentioned biofuels, the scandal of using biomass to burn. I mean, we are in Britain now subsidizing a coal-fired power plant to the tune of £100 million to burn forests, right? Because coal is bad, forest is good, it's renewable. So we give them 100 million to burn forests. These are the issues one has to raise, but we are dealing here with a big cultural, it's almost, reminds me very often the debate about socialism in the olden days. It's a very entrenched ideology, and to break this up and open the debate to see the let's say the pros and cons of certain arguments is difficult with true believers on both sides. It's very difficult, but it's doable, particularly as the public is increasingly disillusioned and concerned and is increasingly burdened by these policies. As long as they don't have to pay, they don't care. But as the prices go up and the costs go up, they become interested, and they are also becoming interested in the arguments. Does this actually make sense, what we're doing? So that is what is happening in Europe. It's not because the Europeans suddenly become intelligent, wise, commonsensical. No, that won't happen. But they have to pay for it, and they don't like it. It's as simple as that. It's market forces policymakers and the public to realize, do we actually want to go in this direction which makes our life more costly, and the life of our competitors is so much better and so much cheaper. Unfortunately, it boils down to these simple facts and not wisdom.
I'm very, interested in whether you or your institute has discussed the issue of trend that in Canada was a more or less direct science policy link as a very high priority change for the federal government labs. And in my own view, initially this sounded nice, like a lot of ideas sound nice, but when you realize what it implies, and I guess I'm a little extreme in my feeling here in terms of science fashions becoming science cults, becoming science religions in one direction, and then from the policy side, results-based scientific investigation. Has this been an issue in the UK? Are you concerned about this, where maybe it's really good if policymakers can simply ignore the overwhelming scientific consensus?
This is one of the more troubling aspects of the mess we're in, is the failure of the scientific community, definitely in Britain and in Europe, but I guess around the world, to look at this in a way traditional science would have done. And what I mean is the scientific community has essentially closed the whole debate about climate science, closed so that they considered the best way of convincing governments that they have to do something is to tell them there is no debate, there is no uncertainty, we know exactly what's happening to the climate, you have to act now. They realized, and I think I know where it started, because remember very early in the debate, I think President Bush Jr. Was hesitant, to sign up to Kyoto and all these debates, and he often referred to saying that the science isn't yet totally settled. It's there are a lot of uncertainties, and the scientific community thought this is terrible. He's using uncertainty as an argument for not signing up to Kyoto. So we can't go on and say, there are still these areas that aren't entirely settled and there are still some uncertainty. They then said, look, it's over. There are no uncertainty. Don't use this argument. We know it's, we are sure that this is a big problem and you have to act now. Now, for the scientific community, they, I think, played a very dangerous game of roulette, because what can happen if this doesn't materialize, and we already see with a warming standstill, which wasn't predicted and is a very inconvenient reality, the scientific community is losing credibility. If you take a very strong position, a collective position, which is totally unscientific as well, and it doesn't materialize what you are predicting, your whole integrity is undermined. And that is the biggest risk to Western science, that they will be exposed as too politicized, too dogmatic, not open for crucial scrutiny. And I think that is this goes way beyond social and economic issues. That goes to the core of the scientific enterprise that used to be part of our biggest jewel in the crown in the Western world. That has been potentially undermined. I'm not, I told you right away, I have no idea what the climate's going to do, right? No idea, totally open-minded, but there is a good chance that the conventional wisdom might turn out to be wrong. And in that case, the established science community will face some very probing questions about the way they behaved at a time when there were, admittedly, minorities of critics, but they shut down the debate. They didn't allow these open questions to be debated, and I think that risks the whole scientific culture.
Hi, Benny.
Hi.
As a member of the mainstream media who's been writing about this issue for a good 15 years now, I know exactly what will happen when I write your message. I know what the letters will say and email messages and that kind of thing. And people will say, okay, so Europe has subsidized green energy, but carbon fuels have been subsidized for decades. And what's your answer to that?
My understanding is that most carbon fuels, I mentioned already in Germany the subsidies for coal, but the vast majority of subsidies for fossil fuels, I think 95%, are actually occurring in the developing and in oil-producing countries. Very, very few direct subsidies are being paid in the Western world to energy companies. They do get tax incentives to explore areas for fossil fuels, but I'm against subsidies in principle. I'm completely against any forms of preferential treatment, be it the nuclear industry or any other industry. It distorts the market, and we generally oppose any forms of energy subsidies. It is bad for the consumer, it's bad for energy prices. It doesn't help anyone other than the people who get the subsidies.
Over here. Hi, Benny. It's Ken Green. How are you? Two questions for you. One, how are the EU governments getting out of the contracts, the renewable contracts they have inked with various landowners and things? Are they just shafting them entirely? Are they giving them alternative tax write-offs? Are they buying them out? Exactly what are they doing? And at this upcoming EU energy summit, isn't it more likely that they're going to double down on attacking shale gas rather than backing off their plans? Wouldn't from the green standpoint, wouldn't the smart thing to do be to find a way to just like kill the shale gas revolution rather than actually accepting it and changing your policy?
On the subsidies, some countries have already begun to cut quite significantly the subsidies. So the incentives, that's for new investors. The ones that are already legally binding, it's very difficult to get out because you would be really sued for compensation But in Spain, they have done that. They've retrospectively told them, sorry, we've run out of cash, basically, and we can't afford it anymore. And they are legal. I mean, this will be a godsend for lawyers. I mean, this will go on. On the shale issue, I mean, that's the crucial, I think, that is the crucial debate for European policy, energy policy, a bit like oil sands in Canada. Europe without shale has no domestic energy left in a few years when, once North Sea oil and gas is gone. So they will be completely reliant on imports. They will sit on this gold mine and won't get it out. It's almost unthinkable that governments would be able to sustain that, which is why I think there will be an increasing clash between the political establishment, who wants the revenue, urgently they need the revenue, and the green lobby, who see this like vampires see crucifixes, right? This is a big problem. And so I expect that the conflict between these two different interests will accelerate and will in coming years dominate the debate. Some countries will go for shale, and I think once shale gas is flowing and the money is coming in, other countries will be very envious and will want to follow. How long this will take, no one knows, but I cannot see Europe completely abandoning the idea of using billions and perhaps hundreds of billions of revenue just because the Greens don't like it. But it might take a few years.
Benny, thank you very much for your presentation today. Canada is currently embarked on a very aggressive trade agreement with the European Union, this Canada-Europe Trade Agreement. Part of one of the obstacles from Canada's perspective is the fuel quality standards that the European Union is adopting right now. Can you provide us any insights on that? We talk a lot about shale gas. Any of us that have visited Europe also know that you pay a lot more at the pump for the fuels that you have, which of course drives up the prices of everything. If you can talk about the European Fuel Quality Directive and share any insights that you might have on that with us, it would be helpful.
I'm afraid I haven't got much more insight than the average newspaper reader. But my understanding is that the EU is split on this issue. And again, this is about the green wing of the European Union versus the more economically minded wing of the European Union. And which side will win is open, but I would think that the weight is shifting towards economic realism. I think we've seen the peak of the strength of the green lobby perhaps 4 or 5 years ago. I think realism, energy realism, is gaining ground, and I would think there is a good chance of a more commonsensical agreement that will benefit both Canada and Europe. But for the time being, the environmental wing in Europe remains strong and they have some ministerial posts as well. So we'll have to wait and see. But as my talk tried to point out, the powers are shifting in Europe, and realism is on the ascendancy, and utopianism is going down quickly.
Well, Well, folks, this has been a very interesting and informative discussion, but all good things must come to an end. So I will now call upon our Vice President, Mr. Peter Burns, to thank our speaker.
Thank you. As Vice President, it's my happy duty to thank a number of individuals and groups for their contributions to today's event. First of all, to you, our audience. Thank you for coming out in such numbers to hear yet another chapter in our crusade against the global warming hypothesis and all its works. I know many of you have supported our luncheons and our other activities for years. I'm sure you will continue to do so. For those of you who may be new to our organization or to the cause we stand for, or maybe even to those of you who are not in support, I ask only that you give us a look at www.friendsofscience.org. We will provide you with scientific information based on real evidence, not model-based hypotheses. Second, I wish to thank the Frontier Center for Public Policy. For several years, they have been our steadfast co-sponsors in so much of what we do. They're a larger organization than FOS, and they cover a wide range of topics of interest to all Western Canadians. I suggest that you check them out as well at their website, www.fcp.org. Thanks. Third, our thanks to Metropolitan Center. Once more, you have provided us with a fine meal in a wonderful venue for such an event. Last, it is my honor and privilege to thank Dr. Benny Peiser for his memorable and thought-provoking talk today. You heard the facts. Europe is facing a crisis due to its reliance on fairy tale philosophies mixed with scientific gibberish. You may have noticed that Benny kept his talks within Europe, but you and I know the same forces that threaten Europe and threaten to bring Europe to its knees are all present here in North America. Think, a government agency in the United States would declare carbon dioxide, essential for all plant life, to be a pollutant? Think again. In Alberta today, 22 school boards are in negotiations with a company that promises to provide wind-powered electric generation. They use the motto, wind is free. As Benny has informed us, that's certainly not the case in Europe. Now, Benny, I know that you did not ask for any form of honorarium. However, we felt it fitting and proper to make a donation in your name to the Center for Affordable Water and Sanitation Technology. This worthy group provides solutions to water problems in Africa. We are very grateful for your presence here today, Benny. Thank you, and thank you all.